So I wrote some notes to remember, but first off, I have to say, Wulalieg, so thank you very much to the traditional people of this territory, to the Seneca, to the Huron-Wendat, to the Mississaugas of the Credit River, and to the Bedouin. Thank you so much for having me in your territory. My name is Rebecca Thomas. I grew up in New Brunswick. I now live in Halifax, but when I get asked, where are you from? They want to hear Lennox Island First Nation, PEI. That's where my dad's from. My dad is a huge inspiration for what I do. When he was 5 years old, he was taken to residential school. He was taken away from his family. He was put into these schools. And for those of you who don't know, residential schools were a policy that Canada implemented over 100 and some years ago to take kids away from their families, and they forced them to speak English and French. They weren't allowed to practice their culture. They weren't allowed to practice their traditions. They weren't allowed to practice their ceremonies. That happened to my dad. And when he was 5 years old, he wasn't able to speak for himself during that process. And as an adult now, he sometimes still has a hard time speaking for himself. So I speak for him. Now, I began writing poetry after I saw my first ever spoken word poem by Elle Jones, who was the previous poet laureate in the position that I hold now. I watched one of her videos on YouTube, and I thought, all right, I'll give it a go. So I wrote a poem. I wrote about how I grew up off reserve. I wrote about how my mom is white, but my dad is Mi'kmaq First Nation. I wrote about how when I'm on reserve, I feel incredibly white, like I don't belong, and when I'm off reserve, I feel incredibly native, like I don't belong. I wrote about how people didn't see me, how I felt. I wrote about my insecurities for who I was. And I practiced that poem over and over and over and over and over again. And it took me months for me to step up on that stage and try it out loud. And I did. And you know when you get very, very nervous, like I am now, and you can hear this noise in your mouth? That's how I felt when I was on stage. I was so nervous. I thought, nobody's going to listen to me. Everyone's going to think that I'm overreacting. So I did my poem, and I got such a round of applause. And I had people come up to me, and they said, Rebecca, you need to speak. You have a message. It's important for you to tell your story. It's important for you to tell the story of your people. And so I did, and I started writing. I only started writing about 6 years ago. So I'm 32 now, right? That puts me at, what, 26 years old? For those of you who think you might be too old to start something, I can tell you that you are wrong, that there's a lot of time left for you to begin. And so going back to that story, I wanted to frame it in a way that made people listen. Because you might hear the same things 10 different times, but if you're only hearing it in one way, then it's very difficult, perhaps, to see a different perspective. Introduction. The following stories deal with mature subject matter that can be disturbing. It is a story about kids whose legacy is deserving of something better than the vetted letter sent home. Lies in cursive promising they weren't so alone. The story is raw. It only includes what we saw, but don't worry, there's hope. Just scroll to the footnotes. Chapter 1, the boats. Let's fast forward through this part. A bunch of men thought they could get a new start. They came to Turtle Island with great intentions to make names for themselves, never stopping to question why we died from all their infections. Chapters 2 through 6, more and more of the same old shh. They thought they were better than us, and we had no power to say enough is enough. Chapter 7, all Indians must go to heaven. Here we're going to take some time. Really delve into the divine, the intentions of those who took our children, the ones who said everything about them was forbidden. It is in this chapter we will spill some serious ink, because it is here we need to shift how you think. Grown men, the future faces of our money, thought that they had some problems, so they devised a national strategy targeting children to solve them. Chapter 8, an exercise in faith. At this point, Canada is all in. We're not trying to trash anyone's religion, but a country chose to disregard our spirituality. The Crown's rules, beliefs, and disdain was our new reality. Pick a denomination. Just be sure you pick the correct one. Chapter 9, so many lost lives. The kids that went in were erased by a system. They lost the spirit under their skin. Many disappeared. Their absent met with tears as police or nuns or no one at all confirmed parental fears. Footnote 1 for scope. Cheney Wenjack's last hope. A boy ran away. was given matches instead of a place to stay, found unmoving and cold, he never got the chance to grow old. Chapter 10, we pick up our pens. Footnote 2, storytelling is something we do, but we decided that your style would be the best way to get through to you. Resume chapter. We begin with unending resilience and laughter. Survivors dictate their stories to those willing to listen. Their voices an additional gift to all they've already given. The leader apologizes. Our reserve finalizes. Chapter 11. A fallen rock star becomes our secret weapon, cherished by the masses by his skilled verses, dedicated his last breath to our purpose. Footnote 3, he refused to let the world forget Cheney. Walalin, please rest peacefully. Chapter 12, we will not be shelved. Determined to be heard, we push back with protest, ceremony, love, and poetic verse. This part is new, settlers didn't rehearse. We will help them along, showing them baby steps first. Footnote 4, we will show them patience, give them an opportunity to do more, but make no mistakes, we will never go back to the way you treated us before. Epilogue, this section is currently being written. It comes at your end, but for us, it marks the beginning. When I was invited to do this talk, I was asked to explain or to talk about being an effective advocate. I get a lot of pushback for what I do. And when you are fighting for something you believe in, I truly believe that it's important that you grow thick skin, but keep a soft heart. And by that I mean people are going to be awful to you. They're going to try to undermine you. They're going to try to take what you have to say, spin it back and say you're wrong. They're going to come after every little weak spot that you have. But you can't let that stop you. And so to give you an example, when I first came into this role as the Poet Laureate in Halifax, it was in 2016, immediately after that, the City Council had a vote to have a conversation about Edward Cornwallis. If you don't know who he is the quote-unquote founder of Halifax. But us Mi'kmaq, us Ilnu know that Jack.org had been around for many thousands of years before Eddie came along. Now, Edward Cornwallis, in order to facilitate the process of expansion, made it legal, no, dare I say, beneficial, to come after our lives. Anyone who brought in a scalp of a Mi'kmaq man, woman, or child would receive a financial compensation. So you can understand why we, as Mi'kmaq people, were not too keen as to having the statue around. It is important to remember history, but there is a difference between remembering something and honoring it. And in my humble opinion, I believe that a statue is a place of honor. If there was a statue right here of Rebecca Thomas, I'd be, holy smokes. Look at that honor. I can't believe they did that for me, right? So for me, it was important that we had a conversation around Edward Cornwallis. Now that motion to have that conversation failed. It didn't go through. And there was nobody at that table who were from the Indigenous community to have that discussion. They had a discussion about us without us. And so I wrote a poem. Fast forward 1 year when I have to deliver a poem in City Council as part of my role as Poet Laureate, and I had two options. I had a poem that I had prepared. It was a love poem. It was entitled, I Wish I Was Better at Writing Love Poems. And it was dedicated to myself, because I think we all need a little bit more self-love. And then the second poem that I had was one that called to task everyone who was sitting in City Council for what they had voted for. One was an easy poem. The other poem was really hard. So, very sweatily, I decided to do the hard poem. Less than a year later, the statue came down. Advocating is hard, and it is a skill. And there are many different things that can make somebody a good advocate. For me, one of those things was recognizing the opportunity that I had. As an activist, as someone who has marched down the street, as someone who has waved the Mi'kmaq flag during Idle No More, who has walked across the McDonald Bridge doing that, as somebody who has actively tweeted at their government to get things done to elicit change, I had an opportunity to have access to politicians. I had an opportunity to have access to media. Not very many activists necessarily have that clout. So for me, I had the responsibility advocate on behalf of my community. And so it was hard to do that poem, to look at all of those council people in the face and say, you were wrong and this is why. But I had to do it. And secondly, it was important for me to show them a different perspective. If I roll up this piece of paper and I hold it with a light here, the shadow that it will project will be a rectangle. And all of you sitting there will swear, you will talk to me till you are blue in the face that it is a rectangle. And I will say, well, why don't you take a couple of steps and come see it from my perspective? And it's a circle. So I'm a big believer of yes and. Yes, it is a rectangle, and it is a circle. Yes, Edward Cornwallis founded Halifax, the garrison town, and he did really terrible things to my people. And it is important that you see that, and it is important that you understand. And then finally, last but not least, it is important to read and to know every facet of the other person's argument, to be prepared so that you know what's coming back at you, right? So that you are prepared to have a conversation. If I had an opportunity to have a conversation with Canada, I imagine it going a little something like this. Hey, Canada. Hey. I know you've been trying. You're starting to own up to all the lying. You're starting to see how hard we've been vying. But the thing is, many of us are still dying. I know you feel bad about our missing women, and I know your heart breaks for our children, the ones who were taken and the ones who live in the foster care system. You've certainly made an effort to get through to me, and I really appreciate that apology, but you have to put a bit more effort into this monotony. You just can't say you're sorry and not take the time to listen, and you need to be patient while you wait to be forgiven. Keep in mind, so much of my family still has substandard living. Think for a minute what it must be like to have never had tap water once in your life. Please, don't interrupt me. I'm not trying to make light. I understand that there's so much on your plate, what with trade and war and what's going down in the United States. I just want you to understand that our lives are still at stake. There's no need to get defensive in this conversation. We all need reminders of what we need to do for reconciliation. You wrote that big report with the TRC, but those 94 calls to action are just a bit of what we need. I mean, people still dress up as me when they go out for Halloween. You did well in getting started. You planted the right seeds, but we all need a spring after winter if we're to regrow our leaves. Remember, we're just relearning how to breathe and how to be free. Just like our teachings, we could all use a little humility. Might I suggest you take some time to read? Have a look at the treaties. I could even suggest a few great lines of poetry. I don't want to scream and fight. I don't want to point to all the times you forgot about our plight. I don't want to get into the nuance of how you thought what you were doing was right, because at the end of the day, you were wrong. You took our culture, our voice, our words, and our songs. You made me feel ashamed for trying to live out a part of me. You denied me from my history. But I bet you didn't know that we were so sneaky, that we kept whispering in the dark when we were supposed to be sleepy, and now we stand in government schools and universities because in spite of your best efforts, we still occupy our territories. I'm not trying to lay blame on your citizens specifically. I know they weren't responsible for our situation personally, but it's important for them to recognize they benefit from our disparity. Here's the thing I want you to take away. We're really open to having you stay, but we're going to have to make new rules by which we can all play. No more telling me who I am. You don't get to be mad just because you don't understand. And we also need to talk about your expectations on how quickly we can actually heal from your exploitations. Again, if you're serious about growing this relationship, it's really important to the process for you to acknowledge all your shit. I'm not saying it's easy, but together we can get through this. It's perfectly normal, your feelings of being distraught. Everyone stumbles when trying to learn something they've never been taught. Making amends is about moving forward, but it's also about knowing when to stop. For example, if we could do something about these cards, the ones you say we need but make access far too hard, let alone it's not us that issues them to start because you still want to identify us by a standard chart. But it's not about you, or how much you think you do, or whether you think you've done enough to be through, because this talk is about us. It's about you earning back our trust. So you can start by talking to your friends and family. You know that racist uncle that keeps saying Indian unapologetically? The ones who refuse to even acknowledge me? The ones who tell me I'm so lucky because mixed-race women are so damn pretty? Calling them out would go a long way in helping me, because they don't want to listen or see what I see. They think I want them begging on their knees. Honestly, I just want some reciprocity. You've given so little, but you've asked so much of me. You hold all the power. I need your help. I'll even say please. Reconciliation can start with such small acts. It doesn't need to be official to make a big impact. So going forward, I have a simple request. I'm asking that you try and do your very best. I don't expect you to get it right every time. Making mistakes is okay and just fine. We're taking on a mountain. It's going to be quite the climb. So I promise to hold your hand if you promise never to let go of mine. Thank you. Being an effective advocate, whether it be for mental health or Indigenous issues or for environmental concerns, whatever it might be, it includes finding your words, finding your strengths, keep persevering and pushing forward. And it also comes with being uncomfortable. It comes with perhaps validating the feelings of somebody you don't agree with and then beginning a conversation from where they're basing those feelings on. Being an effective advocate takes practice. It takes messing up. And so with that, I'm going to leave before I mess up. Thank you so much for having me.